So we're continuing with our study on Jews getting along with each other and trying to be compassionate in cases where our behavior and insistence in particular areas of Jewish law and practice might create hatred or enmity or friction between us and our fellow Jews. The last, and what I hope you've seen throughout this class is sort of an expanding area of Jewish law and thought. That these sorts of accommodations, what we've called accommodations mipnei eva, accommodations that are made for the sake of harmonious relationships between Jews, that we find the original sources for these kinds of accommodations in a very strange place in Jewish law. That is, you remember, it's the cases involving agricultural tithing, right? Because that tractate of the Mishnah creates categories of Jews, those who are more knowledgeable and less knowledgeable, and tries itself to come up with ways where they can get along with each other. But that initial area of thought, tithing, expands over the centuries and gets used to define other areas where compromise might be beneficial for everyone. We saw kashrut being one example, and I think it's sort of the obvious connection between the laws of tithing, because tithing is about food and kashrut is about food. So why not use some of the principles, the leniencies that we learned with regards to tithing, and apply them to, we saw the case of some Jews who are more strict with Gentile butter, some Jews who are more strict with Gentile cheese and Gentile bread, and how various practices ought to be incorporated with each other. And then last week, the accommodations even moved into the area of Shabbat observance. Do you remember that? Where we looked at a rabbi who was more strict about reheating food items, cold food on Shabbat than his hosts. And if you remember, the host said, Rabbi, we prepared a special cold cholent for you because we know you don't reheat food on Shabbat. And remember, the rabbi said, you think I'm going to eat cold cholent on Shabbat? He didn't really say that. That could have been what he was thinking. But he explains what he did by saying, hey, I'm at your house. I'm not going to insult you by insisting that you observe the way I observe. I am your guest, and this is an area that's of Jewish law where I know that there is a known disagreement. I know that you're right. I know that you're wrong. That I know that I'm right. I know that you're wrong. But I know you follow a good authority in what you believe, and so I will eat what you eat. And we also saw the interesting case of the kashrut of an eggplant, which is actually going to come back to haunt us either this week or next week. I introduced you to the idea of orla, right? The the Torah prohibition against eating fruit in its first years. And lo and behold, eggplant is only good in its first years. And this was a matter of dispute in Jewish law that also led to different practices in different households. What I really liked about these sources, I liked much about them, but just a point I want to emphasize about these sources, I think it's very important. These rabbis who are more stringent, and they represent Jews who are more stringent in areas, they are not being accommodating because they believe that there is doubt about their stringency. They're not saying, I'll eat at your table because I know I'm just being picky, or I know it's an issue that's disputed. They all feel, those who are stringent, that they are 100% right about the eggplant, about not reheating food on Shabbat. They are clear according to the law that they are right and the other party is wrong. So what is it that is bringing them to accommodate? It's not doubt about their own observance or doubt about their own principles. It's the fact that they understand that there is an innate pluralism in Judaism that we simply need to accept if we're going to remain one people. That this is not a papacy. Judaism is not a papacy where you have one rabbi who says this is the rule and everyone has to follow. That part of what Judaism is, in order for there to be a thing called Judaism, we need pluralism. We need disagreement. There will always be machloket, as they say in Hebrew, disagreements. And therefore, these accommodations are not being made because the person himself feels doubt about his own case. It's that he or she is being accommodated to a religion that is fundamentally pluralistic. And saying, if I'm going to maintain fealty to the Jewish religion, to Jewish peoplehood, I need to simply accept that there are Jews out there who will follow the approach of their rabbi, and it will be what it will be, right? We will get along with each other as best as we can, even though we each take different approaches. I think that that point is really important in this discussion. What is motivating the accommodation is a respect for Judaism as a pluralistic religion. It is not doubt about whether one party is right or wrong. Parties are convinced, I'm right, you're wrong, but we got to get along with each other. We have to sit at the same table. Someone's got to walk into the US Congress and teach these sources to people in leadership. And forget that, the Congress especially, but even honestly, with the politics today, you could pick any country. Someone needs to go there and say, look, if you want to remain a democratic country, you have to accept the fact that there's going to be differences of opinion, that one side will be right, that one side will be wrong in your eyes, always, but you got to find a way to govern, to get along with each other, to stay united in the midst of your disagreements. So, I said last week, everybody should take this class. Now I'm adding a list of different. Here's another group of people that should take this class. Also politicians who need to learn how to maintain unity in the face of firm disagreements. Right? Because Talmudic Judaism, Rabbinic Judaism, is a Judaism of competition, competing ideas, competing rabbis, vying to be right in every circumstance, but coming back to the table the next day for the next issue. So today we're going to look at two texts. Let's see if we can get through these two, and maybe even more. The first one is from the booklet, and the second one is the one I referred to last time, which is sort of the surprise of the day. It's not in your handbook, but I found this responsum of Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, who died about 20 years ago. This Israeli Haredi rabbi. If you remember, I referenced him last class, and his remarkable responsum on whether to serve food to your guest when you know for sure that your guest will not say a bracha on the food. Now, this is a disagreement, area of disagreement in Jewish law. We'll talk a little bit about it, but I referenced it last week because I happened to go to a session that Rabbi Torchiner was running, and he referenced this, and it's the same theme that we're talking about. How do Jews get along with each other, given different areas of practice, and when can we be more accommodating, and when must we be less accommodating? But before that, let's look at our packets, and I'm going to share my screen with you and ask you, Merle, if you might read for us from Petach HaDvir. So Petach HaDvir, this is a Turkish rabbi. To find some of these sources, here's the thing that you have to understand about, you're looking at this and going, who is Chaim Binyamin Pantremoli? Well, you're not the only one. I also, when I saw this source, said, who is Chaim Binyamin Pantremoli? The way Judaism, like many other philosophies, work is to find. It sometimes takes hard work to find the courageous rabbis who are willing to make accommodations where others are fearful. It's the famous rabbis, unfortunately, the ones who are well known, like to maintain their authority by not being controversial. It's the rabbis who are less well known, who aren't afraid. They have nothing to lose. They don't have any, great status among the Jewish community. So they're the ones that don't have as much to lose, that tend to take positions that might be a little bit more controversial. So Pantremoli is one of them. It also is worth noting that he is living in Turkey. Turkey is one of those countries. Remember, this is sort of what we fail to understand, some of us, about the development of Judaism in the Arab world. For the 19th century, even the beginning of the 20th century, Jews were much more integrated into Muslim society than they were integrated into Christian society. And so these rabbis in Eastern lands like Turkey, had to deal with very different situations, both when it comes to Jewish interactions with the non-Jewish world, but also Jews that, since they were accepted more into the non-Jewish world, were facing conflicts and tensions that Jews in Eastern Europe were not yet to see or to feel or to encounter. So, Merle, are you unmuted?
Yep, I am.
Okay, would you do us the honor of reading from Petach
Sure.
HaDvir, who speaks on this issue? And again, I'm going to interrupt you. Please don't be offended.
No. From all of this, it is clear that even with respect to a bona fide rabbinic prohibition like Gentile bread, they permitted to eat with someone who is not careful with that prohibition when it feels impossible to avoid it.
So remember, let's go back for a second to the Mishnah Brura. The Mishnah Brura, who is the commentator on the Shulchan Aruch, probably the most accepted authority in the Ashkenazi world when it comes to Jewish law. If we go back to what he says, remember here what the Shulchan Aruch says, okay? Here, the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, says, don't worry about the dish that the Gentile bread was cooked in. Okay? He doesn't say anything about the bread itself. In other words, the Shulchan Aruch does not permit eating Gentile bread, if that's not what you do, with somebody who does eat Gentile bread. He just says, well, you don't have to worry about the dishes. Only the Ramah, the Ashkenazic commentator, talks about eating Gentile bread itself. Right? And he says we make an exception for bread. What's his rationale? It says, because bread is the essence of the meal. In other words, you're really going to upset your friend if you don't eat the main course in his house. But remember, he says, but don't extrapolate from this case to other prohibitions. But going back also to the Mishnah Brura, if I can find it, here we go. Merle, can you read this for me when I'm highlighting?
Sure. But if something is truly forbidden, even on a rabbinic level, God forbid to violate it on account of the fear of enmity and dispute.
So look where we are. Mishnah Brura is writing in Eastern Europe, right? So look where we are in the Ashkenazi world. Even if something is forbidden on a rabbinic level, you cannot apply the rationale of fear of enmity or disputes on those types of disagreements. This is only a matter to be considered when thinking about customs. You have your custom, I have my custom. We can accommodate each other's differences in custom. I can be lenient when it comes to customs. But rabbinic level prohibitions, says the Mishnah Brura, God forbid to violate it on account of fear of enmity and dispute. Well, in Turkey, looks like somebody broke the taboo. And he says very clearly, it is a bona fide rabbinic prohibition. That is, the eating of Gentile bread. Remember, everybody, what is the concern about Gentile bread? The concern is non-kosher ingredients might have been used, and you cannot taste or smell them when it comes to bread. It's not like it's not like an item where you can identify. Bread is a difficult item to identify whether something non-kosher has been used in its production. And so there is a strict prohibition that is invoked by the rabbis, not by the Torah. Bona fide rabbinic prohibition. You cannot eat Gentile bread. But not everybody followed this. And you can imagine for yourselves why it was that some people did not follow the rule on Gentile bread. Well, if you think about it, the rule in itself is a siyag la Torah. It is a fence around a real prohibition. What's the real prohibition? The real prohibition is you can't eat non-kosher ingredients. That's the real prohibition. The rule about not eating Gentile bread is the fence that we draw. And since we're careful about not eating non-kosher ingredients, we're not going to eat Gentile bread because we don't trust it. Well, you can think about a certain community where everybody knows the baker. And you can ask the baker, what do you use for your bread? It's not a simple process to make bread. Not everybody has hours to make bread at home. So I would think that some Jews in Turkey, I guess in Turkey it wouldn't be bread, it would be lafa or pita. But I would think that some people want to just get it from the guy selling it on the street, and they know him. And remember, Turkey, they're Muslims, so they're not using lard in the ingredients. So what's the big deal? Can't I ask the baker on the street to bake me some pita? And the Petach HaDvir says, even though that is the case, that we do not eat Gentile bread, we learn from all of these sources that we can eat it with someone who is not careful with that prohibition. So that's important. You cannot go out. He's not saying you can go out on the street yourself and buy the bread, but you can eat at your friend's house who you know isn't careful with the rules of Gentile bread when it feels impossible to avoid it. Now, what does that mean when it feels impossible to avoid it? I mean, I can always refuse to eat at somebody's house. So he doesn't explain what that means when it feels impossible to avoid it. I just think, if you ask me, I think he's saying that to make himself feel better. You know, you're stumbling on the road and you have nowhere to eat and everyone's closed, and the only person who's inviting you to their house is somebody who isn't careful with the rules of Gentile bread. But I think deep down this is revealing a sense that when it comes to getting along with each other in Turkey in the 19th century, we need to be lenient on some areas where a lot of people don't follow the rules. And the rationale, go ahead, Merle.
Given that the host has invited the guest, his desire is that the guest will eat and rejoice on his table.
Right. So this is just reminding everybody, this is not because the Petach HaDvir feels that the rules on Gentile bread are too strict, or because he feels that the rules don't apply anymore. This is about accommodating the community. This is about being able to eat together. If he sits there
and doesn't eat because he is strict about Gentile bread, the host will be very upset and there will be enmity and strife. And in those cases, they permitted departing from normative practice on account of disputes, because great is the power of peace.
Right.
And this was the proof of the Zachor LaAvraham.
We're going to go back to that. That's the text we reviewed last week.
For the practice of those rabbis, because even though they forbade to eat Gentile butter because it is not an essential part of the meal in the same way as bread, and the case of those rabbis did not involve bread, and they nonetheless were permissive for themselves, their case was one of reheated food, which involves enmity in the same way that bread does.
So look what he's saying here. He doesn't buy the whole butter thing. He says, I don't buy that. But remember the butter argument? Why is it that we can, okay, well, bread, I'll eat your Gentile bread, but I won't eat your Gentile butter. Remember why? It was sort of a silly thing. The Zachor LaAvraham said, because a lot of people don't eat butter. In other words, you don't need butter. It's not the core part of your meal. Your host will just say, maybe Grover doesn't like butter. It's not like if you don't eat the bread is the whole meal. Don't bother coming to my house if you're not going to eat the bread. But nobody will get upset over you not eating bread, but over you not eating butter. But the Petach HaDvir doesn't buy it. I don't buy that, he says. Why? Because we learned about the case of reheated food. Let's go back to our case about reheated food from last week. Remember that? The case of reheated food. I have heard people say that the esteemed rabbinic leaders who were very careful never to return food to an oven on Shabbat nonetheless eat in the homes of people who were not themselves careful about this and would routinely return food to an oven on Shabbat in order to reheat it. In this case, one could have said, if I'm going to your house and I know you don't like to, I know you reheat food on Shabbat, I could say to you, I like my stew cold. I like my food cold. And your host would make nothing of it. In other words, the case of reheating food is parallel to the case of Gentile butter. They are the same. Because just like it's possible to come up with a reason for why I won't eat Gentile butter, and thereby I won't look like I'm insulting my host. I'll just say, I don't like butter. I could do the same thing on Shabbat with reheated food and say, I don't like stew, or I don't like my chicken hot. Now, maybe you're saying to me, well, come on, Rabbi. No, everyone likes their chicken hot. They won't believe you. Okay, fine. I give you that. I give you that. But I think according to the Petach HaDvir, he says the case of the reheated food proves that one can make accommodations in all circumstances for the sake of people getting along, even when you might say to yourself, well, I shouldn't accommodate because I could always come up with the excuse that I don't like butter. Well, Rabbi Ephraim Navon that we saw here, remember, Ephraim Navon, not only did he say, I will eat your food, but he said, I insist on eating your reheated food. Because if I don't, I'm de facto insulting you and your practice and telling you you're doing something wrong. Remember what he says, when I am in my house, I eat what I please. Here I eat what you eat. That's going much further than the case about butter. Does everyone understand that? The case about butter was not what I eat, what you eat. The case of the butter resolves itself by saying, if you can get away with it, don't eat the stuff that you're not comfortable eating. If you can get away with it. But if you can't get away with it, like with bread, okay, fine, you eat the bread. But if you can get away with not eating the butter, do it. Rabbi Ephraim Navon says, no. I will eat what you eat. That is what people do who want to come together in a spirit of mutuality and respect. Right? I won't try and find little ways where I can come up with excuses for what for eating certain foods and not eating other foods. So does everyone understand that? What Petach HaDvir does? He basically throws out that whole case about Gentile butter, given what we have learned about the leniencies found in reheating food.
For someone who is lenient to reheats all the good food on Shabbat. Someone who is strict about this will refrain from eating anything at the Shabbat meal other than plain bread. This will clearly make the host concerned and upset, and there is no greater enmity than this.
Everyone understands that? Someone who is strict will refrain from eating anything at the Shabbat meal other than plain bread. In other words, Rabbi Ephraim of Navon could have said, all I'll have is the bread, thank you very much. All I'll have is the bread, but nothing else. I don't want to have the heated food. But he says, come on, this will clearly make the host concerned and upset, even if you'll eat the bread. The host is serving a big meal. Don't tell me you can have this, but you won't have that because everything else that's on the table is treif. And your guest will say, no problem. No way. Your guest is going to say, how dare you? You came to my table and you're going to eat a piece of bread, but none of the other food that I made for you?
Therefore, they permitted themselves to eat for the reason we said. The enmity we fear is not because they are scornful of an observant person, heaven forbid. On the contrary, their desire is to show great honor those who fear God around their table. In this context, it is permitted because peace is great.
Oh, I love this. How does he end the discussion here? It's not the negative, lest there be enmity. Because if we end on that tone, lest there be enmity, we are in fact saying what we really don't want is for people who are less observant than us to be saying, look how cuckoo those strict Jews are. That's not what we're worried about. It's not the negative, lest there be enmity. We end this discussion with the positive twist. Peace is great. This isn't about me protecting the honor of the Torah or my stringencies or what I feel is authentic. That's not what this is about. This is about creating a society where peaceful relations are a value for everyone at every table. Peaceful relations between Jews and neighbors. And anything we can do to find bridges, ways to compromise, ways to accommodate, we will pursue that. Now, the Mishnah Brura is in a different world. In a different world in Eastern Europe, doesn't come close to saying anything like that, which is why going back to my point about who is Rabbi Ponchermoli. Well, Rabbi Ponchermoli is somebody who's very brave and willing to say what they couldn't say in Eastern Europe at the same time, which is we need to get along with each other. A few years ago, I talked about in a sermon the differences between the Sephardic world and the Ashkenazi world, and you get a little sense reading these sources about those differences. In the Ashkenazi world, because of Reform Judaism, the authorities couldn't say something like this. They had to take a stand. They had to draw a boundary. They couldn't permit eating in other people's homes because there it wasn't about Gentile bread. It was about Gentile everything. It was about Gentile steak. In other words, it was about non-kosher. It was about shrimps and crabs, and it had gone too far. And so the rabbis in Eastern Europe had to draw a line, and that's that line that says, do not extrapolate to any other case. We have to be strict. This is only about custom. It's not even about rabbinic law. But in the Sephardic world, there was no reform movement. In Turkey, there was no reform movement. And so when they faced challenges of modernity, they took a completely different approach, not to draw thick borders, but do just the opposite. And encourage, as I think you see in this last line very clearly, strongly encourage differences of practice to be minimized between one community and another community of Jews. This is about minimizing differences even on issues of rabbinic level. That means issues that I deeply feel are important and right and central to my Jewish practice. I should still look for compromise on those issues because peace is great. Look at what is motivating Rabbi Ponchermoli is let's keep everybody together. We need harmony. That is not what motivates the Mishnah Brura. That's Rabbi Yisrael Meir HaKohen Kagan. If you look up a bit about his life, if you want to look up a bit about his life and story, he's operating in a totally different milieu. He has different motivations. He doesn't want to make too many accommodations because it's time he feels to draw up the barriers, make the fences taller. And that's the approach of the Ashkenazi world versus the approach in the Sephardi world. Now, what about the approach in the modern Israeli world? Who likes learning about the politics of Ultra-Orthodox Judaism? Let's take a look at this responsum that I found just this morning for you by Rabbi, I'm sharing the wrong one. by Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. There we go. Let me just make this a little bit bigger so you can all see it. Maybe a little bit bigger. There we go. Can you all see that on my screen? I know it's a lot of Hebrew. Don't worry, I'm gonna translate. I will also, let's share this for you. In your chat box, I'm gonna, in case you want to print this out, this is a new source, just one responsum, if you'd like to print it out and show it to your friends. There we go. Who was Shlomo Zalman Auerbach? Major authority on Jewish law in Israel, Orthodox, of course. There's even a neighborhood named after him in Jerusalem. You may have been to the neighborhood in Jerusalem called Ramat Shlomo. The Ramat Shlomo neighborhood is named after him. That's how important he was. He was born in Jerusalem and died in Jerusalem. So no influence from the outside. Understood how Israeli society worked. And he was born in 1910, passed away in 1995. He writes here about a law in Shulchan Aruch, the code of Jewish law, the medieval code of Jewish law, that I didn't translate because it's pretty easy to understand. It's right here, okay? Lo yiten le'echol, ella lemi sheyodea bo levarech. 8 words, okay? But we need to understand those 8 words in order to understand what he's going to say. Lo yiten le'echol, do not give food. Ella lemi sheyodea bo sheyevarech. To anyone except, there's double negatives here. To anyone except one who knows how to bless. Some of you may not have known that that is a Jewish law. You may not feed someone who's not going to say Birkat Hamazon, who's not going to say Hamotzi Lecha Min Haaretz. You cannot feed somebody like that. And it says here in the Ashkenazi commentary, this is the Ramah, Yesh Mekilim im noten la'ani betorat staka. What is an ani? Except if they're poor. Because if someone is poor, you're not giving it really as food, you're giving it as staka. So if it's somebody poor, you can give them food, but to somebody who is of means, you should not feed them if you know that they will not say the blessings over the food. Now, this is a quick translation that I just did this morning on the opinion of Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach on the question of kibud ba'achila v'shtiya lemi sheyodea lo levarech. Honoring a person with food and drink, but a person who does not know how to bench, who does not know, or who will not, sorry, it's not who does not know, who you know will not say the bracha. You know he will not bench. And he puts it in this category called He'arot be'inyan isur lifnei iver. Anyone know what that means, lifnei iver? Lifnei iver is the transgression in the Torah. Do not place a stumbling block before the blind. Because for him, not just for him, but for him, including many others, this prohibition is about placing a stumbling block. Why? A stumbling block is something you put in front of somebody else that will cause them to fall, to trip. And is that not what you are doing when you serve lunch to somebody who will eat without saying a bracha? Are you guilty of placing a stumbling block before him or before her? So, Shelley, are you able to read for us? There's 3 sections here. I'd like to go over them carefully. I will be interrupting you frequently. Please, again, don't be offended.
Okay.
In the matter.
In the matter that a person must be careful in his ways and ensure that all his deeds are for the sake of heaven, I wish to consider the following case. One who is hosting an important guest who does not observe the commandments, but he still loves Torah study and contributes to Torah institutions.
Now stop there, okay? Now here you get a bit of the sense of political realities in Israel. I want you to ask yourself the same thing that we asked ourselves about the last source. What is motivating the Petach Hadvir? Why is it that he comes to this conclusion that peace is great and we have to get along with each other, that is not motivating Rabbi Kagan, who says no compromise except on matters of custom? You have a little hint here about, I actually think it's a big hint, about what is motivating right from the start. What's going to motivate Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach? This is not just any guest that's coming to your house. It's an important guest. What do you think he means by important guest, Shelley? What do you think he means? He means rich. He means somebody rich is coming, wants to come to your house. An important guest is, if you're not religious, then there's only one reason you're coming to a religious person's house, right?
Right.
Okay, if you know anything about how ultra-Orthodox society works, a poor secular Jew he's going to have a hard time getting an appointment with a big rabbi. But if you have money, you can get in front of the line. And not only do we know he's rich because he's called important in this response. Let me just make sure that I did a good job translate it. Oreach chashuv. There you go. Oreach chashuv, an important guest. Asher eineno shomer Torah umitzvah. He doesn't observe the commandments. Aval adayin yesh lo ahava livnei Torah. But it's somebody who respects bnei Torah. What does that mean to you, Shelley? Somebody who respects bnei Torah.
Well, he wants to, someone who's wants to be in the right place and do the right thing.
You're too nice. Be more cynical. Be more cynical. What does it mean he has love for students of Torah?
I don't know.
It means he's on our side. It
Oh.
means he's on our team. He may not be, think about Israeli politics, right? Israeli politics, very contentious, the role of the ultra-Orthodox in society. Very big issue. They're constantly, this is the whole reason for all these elections and minority governments, right? Is because you have 10 different parties in Israel that are only out to defend the interests of their particular branch of Orthodoxy. And defend their interests means protect their yeshivas, protect their exemption from the army, protect the rights that they get according to the status quo agreements, right? So I'm building up for you the pressure of this case. I have a rule that says I'm not allowed to give somebody a meal who's not going to say a bracha on the food. But here's the problem. I've got someone coming in. He's got a lot of money.
And
He's on our team.
Yeah.
Even though he himself isn't observant, he believes that it's important for us to keep getting our army exemptions and that we have our yeshivas and that we abide by the status quo. On the political issues that we care about, he's on our side. And that's why, by the way, I wasn't going to present this to you, but I think it's so fascinating understanding the context. I mean, I hope it doesn't cause you all to lose respect for these rabbis and say, well, everybody's just manipulating the Torah to get to the desired outcome they want to advance their own selfish interests. I didn't say that. I'm saying some of you might be saying that. Do not quote me. Some of you might be saying that, and I would actually understand where you're coming from. I like to look at it a little bit more generously. I'm just saying, try to understand where everybody's coming from. They have different fights to fight in Lithuania than they had in Turkey, than they have in modern day Israel. Let's think about the fights that Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach is fighting in modern Israel as a representative of the ultra-Orthodox, the yeshivas. And now we can understand his question a little bit deeper and his answer a little bit more. He's saying, this is somebody who plays for our team, even though he himself isn't observant. And here he says it flat out why he really is concerned about not angering this guest. Gam tomech b'mosdot Torah uchadome. He's also a big donor. Okay, he just said it flat out. So nobody here can accuse me of insinuating things into this discussion. He says it right out. This is somebody rich. I'm actually shocked that he actually spelled it out. I would, if he wouldn't have said this, I would have said he's probably talking about somebody rich. But he can't say that because then he's saying we should give preferential treatment in Jewish law to people who have money. Can you believe that? He would be saying, hey, we can make accommodations to people who have money and who donate that we can't make for people who don't donate. But he actually is going to say that. He's spelling it out very clearly. It's a big donor. Okay, Shelley, go ahead. Should the host
welcome him properly with food and drink, considering the prohibition of the Shulchan Aruch? And
right, so you understand what that prohibition is? The prohibition that is above, one does not give food or drink to someone who will not say a blessing.
Right. And if the host would ask his guest, even in a respectful way, to wash his hands and bless, the guest would see it as disrespectful, and it would upset
him
and cause him to be even more distant from Torah, and perhaps even hate Torah followers.
So look what's at stake here. If I say to this guy, would you kindly, even in a respectful way, would you kindly go up to the sink and say the bracha? Right? He is worried, Shlomo Zalman, that such a person would see it as arrogance. How dare you not respect the fact, after all the money I've given you, how dare you not respect the fact that I do Judaism my way and you do it your way? And it might even lead him to hate Torah followers, right? He'll say, look at these guys. They're a bunch of fanatics who will not accommodate for any reason. The guy insisted that I bench. He wouldn't even give me a piece of bread unless I said the bracha. After all the money I've given him, goodbye. That's what's at stake here.
In this case, I believe it is good and true to honor the guest with proper food and drink, and not to worry about lifnei iver.
Right. Surprise, surprise. The rabbi finds a way to please his wealthy donor. It is true to honor him. You can do it with food and drink. And don't worry about lifnei iver. Don't worry about, and he's going to list actually a few things you don't have to worry about. Don't worry about, first of all, the challenge of placing a stumbling block before the blind. What else do we not have to worry about? Shelley, for even though
we have learned that 1, we do not perform a small sin in order to save others from larger sins.
those of you who took my class last year, we learned this rule. One does not perform a small sin in order to save others from a larger sin. Do you all remember? I don't even remember, but last year we learned about the ship and building the ramp off a ship, but you were going to have to build it on Shabbat. It was this imaginary case of building a ramp off a ship to get everybody off the ship so they wouldn't violate Shabbat. It was a crazy, crazy case, but it all related to this idea that I should not sin myself, even a minor sin, in order to save somebody else from a larger sin. Or by the way, last year, some of you might remember, we learned about the Lafa oven, right? That was on Shabbat. My friend forgot he left his pita in the oven and it's about to bake. Should I, his friend, take the pita off the oven before it bakes? Which is a minor prohibition on Shabbat compared to the major prohibition of cooking. Should I peel it off in order to save my friend from violating that major prohibition? And the answer is no, not your problem. Your friend did that. It's his problem. Don't you take a minor sin to save him from a major sin. Now, in this case here, I could say, maybe I should tell this guy, I'm not serving you any food because I don't want you to sin. And if you eat, you're going to sin. And there's no rule in the Torah that says I have to serve you food. So I'm not going to serve you food. That's a minor thing to save you from eating without a bracha, which is a major thing. But Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Rabbah says, don't worry about that. Not important. Because this case is, well, he's going to say, because this case is different. Number one, you don't have to worry about lifnei iver. You don't have to worry about putting a stumbling block before the blind. Number two, you don't have to worry about this rule that we don't do a small sin to save somebody else from a larger sin. And number three, here's something we learned together.
We do not separate maaser on Shabbat in order to stop others from eating tevel.
Exactly. That you should know all those words. Everybody who's been in this class with me since we started in October should know these words. Maaser is the tithe. There's a rule. Remember, we learned you can't separate tithes on Shabbat. You're not allowed to do it. You're separating. Separating is one of the Torah prohibitions on Shabbat. And since we learn that rule, one might ask, but what if I'm looking at a bunch of friends who are about to have challah and we never took maser from the challah? Shouldn't I do it to save them from eating tevel, food which was not tithe? That's against the Torah. The answer is, in Jewish law, no. You cannot separate maaser on Shabbat, even if you're looking at your friends who are about to eat tevel. Not a good enough excuse. Don't meddle in a situation, a bad situation that is already going to happen. He's bringing this up because something else you could say about the host is maybe the host should say, I'm not going to serve him food because serving food is initiating the sin. I'm responsible for the fact that this man is going to sin. But Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Rabbah says, don't worry about it. You're not responsible. These don't apply in this situation. In this case, the matter is different. And why is it different? Shelley, here
we must weigh the possible placing of a stumbling block against the certainty that the guest will perform much greater transgressions if he is not welcomed respectfully. Thus, there is no transgression here. This case should not be regarded as the placing of a stumbling block, but rather the replacing of a large stumbling block with a small
I
stumbling.
love this. He actually says this, folks. I am not making this up. You can read it in the Hebrew. Michshol gadol, michshol yoter katan. You're replacing what you're actually doing here. You can't compare these cases to the cases of the tithing and the cases of the lifnei iver and a case of the small sin compared to a larger sin. He's very practical here. He says, look what you're actually doing. If you don't give this man to eat, that is a large stumbling block. He's defining that not treating a guest respectfully who likes Torah and Judaism and ultra-Orthodox causes. If you don't give him food to eat, you are placing a large stumbling block before him. He will trip on that. He will trip on your disrespectful behavior and sin thereby. Now, what sin will he do, Shelley? What sin is he going to do if he trips on the stumbling block that you create by not giving him food? What's the sin he's talking about here?
Well, he by eating improper.
No. That's the small stumbling block. If I don't give him food, what's the sin I'm encouraging him to commit? If I don't give him food, he will sin by no longer supporting Torah institutions, by hating Torah students, by not supporting the yeshivas, by being jealous and angry of the ultra-Orthodox. Those are big sins. That's, if you don't give him food, you're placing a huge stumbling block before him, encouraging him, almost deceiving him into major transgressions. Giving him food, that's a small stumbling block. Okay, you're right. You gave him food and he should have said a bracha. But come on. What is at stake for Shlomo Zalman Auerbach? What is he really worried about? Getting people on his side on the political issues? Or whether a secular Jew says Borei Pri Hagafen or not before he drinks a glass of wine? What's big for him and what's small for him?
Yeah, it's the big thing is the support.
That's right. That's really important. We got to keep our donors happy. We got to keep people on our side happy. Who cares that he didn't say hamotzi?
But would he apply this same thing to just the average person? I mean, this is all about money.
See, that is an excellent question for our discussion. We're going to start off our discussion with that question.
Okay.
I don't want to give it away.
Okay.
There's two other sections here. And
Okay.
it seems to me
that if someone sees his friend drinking Orla wine, and the only way to stop him is to switch the wine to Tevel wine or Stum Yemen wine, Yenam wine, then he does so.
Okay, let me define a little bit for you here. I'm seeing my friend, remember we learned Orla? Orla's the eggplant, right? I'm seeing my friend drinking Orla wine, grapes that were harvested before they were permitted to be harvested. That's forbidden according to the Torah. But my friend is a drunk, so he needs wine. I'm not going to be able to give him a Coke and say, here, be satisfied with this. I open up my wine cabinet and say, wait, friend. Don't drink that wine. That's Orla wine. But look what I have in my cabinet. I have two other wines in my cabinet that are not as bad as Orla wine, but they're still bad. Tevel wine, which means I haven't tithed it, and stamyenum wine, which means wine that may have been used for idolatrous purposes. But since it may have been used for idolatrous purposes, it's not as serious a prohibition as Orla wine. Should I give those wines, should I replace one with the other? What does he say? Yes, you do so. It's the same situation. I'm taking a big stumbling block, that's the Orla wine, and replacing it with a small stumbling block. This is not setting a stumbling block before his friend, but saving him from a greater sin. It is my responsibility to diminish and reduce as much as possible the sins that my friend might commit based on what I do or what I am able to do. Makes sense, right? With the wine, you have wine that is super not allowed and wine that is just regular not allowed. Let's put it that way. It's permitted to switch a super, not only it's permitted, but it's required, if you can, to switch a super bad wine with a regular bad wine. You're trying to reduce the person's sin, trying to minimize it. That's what a good friend does. Okay, the last piece here, and then we'll stop. Shelley, go ahead. In a similar case,
we note that we do not purchase seventh-year produce from an Am Haaretz, even though by doing so, we would be taking from him the forbidden produce.
It's a similar case. I go to the shuk and I see somebody who's selling shavi'it. He's selling produce from the 7th year. Are you allowed to do that? No. But he needs the money. So what do I think to myself? I'm a very pious Jew. I say, you know what I should do? Some poor Jew is going to buy this who's not as careful as me, and he's going to eat that 7th year produce. So I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to buy that 7th year produce from this guy, from the seller at the shuk. And what am I going to do with the produce? Throw it out. I'm not going to eat it. It's not allowed. I'll throw it out. And that way I will save my friend from buying that produce and not knowing that it's forbidden produce to eat. So you see how it's similar, right? It's me doing something to prevent somebody else from performing a great sin. That case
is parallel to ours, as the sin is the same.
Right.
It's even possible that the Am Haaretz might use money for greater sins than the sin of selling forbidden fruit.
So he says, look at the logic you're using is flawed. We cannot purchase produce from somebody like that, because let's say the person who I gave the money to, the guy selling the forbidden produce at the shuk, let's say he uses that money on something he's not allowed to use it on. Like you see, we say in Hebrew, ein la davar sof, your extrapolations of what might happen based on your actions, there is no end to that way of thinking. I buy the 7th year produce, so my friend doesn't buy the produce, but I'm giving money to the salesman. But what if the salesman uses the money I give him to, I don't know, buy some ham to have for lunch? Am I responsible for him buying that sandwich? You can't do that, he's saying. You can't extrapolate from one case. What if I do this? What if I do that? In other words, I'm not responsible totally for this person that I've invited to my house not saying the bracha. If he chooses not to say the bracha, it's not on me. I'm just giving him lunch. This is the same
as someone who cuts off a finger in order to save the whole hand, such as a person is healing, not damaging, and it is a mitzvah to act accordingly.
Right. Sometimes you have to cut off the finger to save the hand. What is the finger? The finger is serving the food to this guy. I know that you're not supposed to serve food to somebody who won't say a bracha. I know that. That's a sin, but it's this sized sin. Ruining this man, turning him against our cause and our institutions, that's a this size sin. That's the size of my whole hand. So cut off the finger in order to save the hand. That's not a big sin. That's a small sin. And you are not damaging. You're not sinning because you're serving him food. You're healing him. Whoa.
Here in our case, the host is not transgressing, but rather saving him from more serious sins like hating Torah and its scholars. It is proper to give him food and drink and honor him. And upon this, the Bible teaches, do not rebuke mockers, or they will hate you.
Right, that's from the book of Proverbs. So the book of Proverbs teaches, Proverbs, if you've ever looked at the book of Proverbs, it's these little sayings about life. Do not rebuke mockers, or they will hate you. In other words, don't antagonize people who are not religious. They'll turn against you. And that's what you're going to do if you don't give him a meal, if you don't treat him with the necessary respect. And since
your restrictive actions will not have any benefit, you will be causing him to violate the Torah commandment of, you shall not hate your brother.
Lo tisna achilcha bivavecha, it says in the book of Vayikra, you shall not hate your brother. If you don't feed him, you are going to cause him, your guest, to sin a big sin. What is the sin? You will be causing him to hate his fellow Jews. And that will be on you. And that's a much bigger sin than saying a bracha or not saying a bracha before you have your sandwich. Now, something else that it says at the bottom here, it is well known that the Chazon Ish did not permit in such a case. The Chazon Ish was from the generation before Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. And he also was in Israel at the time. He did not permit in a similar situation, he did not permit serving food to such a guest. Why? Because as I said, the Chazon Ish had different battles to fight. For the Chazon Ish, he wasn't involved in modern Israeli politics. The importance of having people support the yeshivas, that wasn't a big issue in his day. So he could afford to be stringent. The Chazon Ish's view was, we need to stay separate from dangerous Israeli secular society as much as possible. Shlomo Zalman Auerbach's view is, we need to find partners wherever we can find them among secular Jews. Anyone who agrees with our cause, we should invite to sit at our table. I wonder, by the way, who this man is. But, there are many people who, let's say, their father was a great rabbi, or they have a lot of respect for tradition, but they say, well, I can't do it myself. So they donate. That's their way of showing their commitment. They say, well, I'm not going to be observant, but I will donate to institutions. And God forbid would we anger or disappoint or turn off such a person in the era of Rabbi Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. I'm going to stop the recording now.